Well, thank you all for coming. What a great turnout, and what a beautiful day. And Pueblo style, we always start with a blessing. My husband will do the blessing.
With Alamos, of the great spirit, we want to bring everybody together for this special occasion. And we're from Greece, and we're Dene, and I'm just so glad that all of you have shown up. That's how we say Santa Fe and this area, and we're always here to remind us that the volcano behind us was here 10 million years ago, and we're just the new guys on the block. It's a beautiful place to be here, and I want to thank all of you for being here in a good way so we can continue to live and be our artists that we were put here to do. Da.
Thanks, honey. And I want to thank Diane Stoffel, the gallery manager of this beautiful space, for giving us opportunity to show our work. I'm going to get out of the sun here. I'd like to start by acknowledging my art biases, just so you know. The first thing is that art and science are different. And even though we're up here in Los Alamos and all these wonderful scientists are around in the scientific method, we need to be grateful for, especially for the vaccine that kept us all safe from the virus. But to me, science doesn't answer the existential questions like, why are we here? Did we get here? Where are we going? What's our purpose? So those are the questions that I'm interested in as an artist. I'm not interested in the science question, except as it informs my art. So that's one bias. The other is, I feel as a visual artist, you need to offer your audience a lot to respond to visually. So I'm totally uninterested in minimal art. I'm happy that people like to do that, and good for them, but I want you to have a lot to look at and a lot to think about. Because if you're a visual artist, why put up the least you can do when you can put up so much? So those are kind of my biases. The past 20 years, I've worked on identity issues, and I focused on three main things that I think are like the pillars of identity, and those are place, genetics, and language. And language is my main interest. I was an English major in college, and so I come full circle back to that. So what I'd like to do is take everybody through maybe 4 pieces in the exhibition and talk specifically about them in each of those categories. And we're going to start with genetics, and there are kind of 2 exhibitions I'd like to talk about, and I want to acknowledge Belinda Edwards over here, because she and I and 2 other artists came very early on to this interest in genetics. We had our DNA tested by National Geographic Genographic Project, which was one of the early DNA analysis programs. And then the 4 of us came up with this incredible museum, this incredible series of exhibitions called Mining the Unconscious. And it was time in 2011, the year after Carl Jung's Red Book was made public. He embargoed the publication of that book something like 50 years after his death. And Belinda was the driving force behind 20 community programs that were associated with the 3 exhibitions that we did. So that was our first sortie into genetics. The second one came when my sisters and I have 3 sisters, no brothers. As our father aged, we started taking turns going down to take care of him. He was still living in Florida, and my mother had already walked on. And when we were there, we discovered in the garage the love letters and the diaries of my paternal grandparents. He was going to throw them out. My sisters and I said, no, that's our heritage, you cannot do that. So without his permission, basically, we smuggled them out of Florida and brought them back to New Mexico. And
You kids got us in trouble.
this is my oldest daughter. And she says things like that. I don't know where she gets it. But the first thing I did was transcribe all the love letters, and I gave them to each of my children when they married. And then I started in on the diaries. And this woman, my paternal grandmother, kept diaries for more than 60 years. I could never even do a week, so I was very impressed with her. And I took some photos and their writing from her diaries and the love letters, and that's what this series of work is. There are actually 12 pieces of work in here. And I took the photographs and the diaries and love letters themselves to a man who could do giclée prints, and he was able to insert the photographs into some of the writing, and it was so interesting to sit in the dark by his computer and do this. And you could actually see where they pressed down hard with their pencil and where it was lighter, and they were actually doing the writing back and forth to each other. And I really felt their presence in that. So that's what these are. That's the main body of work that I did on genetics, except for this scroll here. This is called Gene Pool. And this is a loaned piece to the exhibition. We have some people here who've loaned work back to the exhibition, which I really appreciate because, your good work often sells, and then when you have an exhibition, you're left with what didn't sell. And so Michael Sharber loaned some work back, and this is a loan from another person, and I was thinking of the DNA here. So that's that piece. The piece that you're standing under here, this piece is called Assimilation. And I became very aware of assimilation when I moved to New Mexico. I mean, we're all assimilated because we're all immigrants and so forth, but I was looking at this in terms of how language actually can be a weapon of assimilation, and particularly here because the Native American languages have not been written, and the boarding school experience forced them to abandon their own languages and learn English. And now there's a revival effort underway to save the native languages. You heard my husband speak some of it in the prayer. So this was about that, but also about what is happening to language with technology. So the story of this, the cubes, is this. I was sitting in a cafe drinking coffee in Albuquerque and reading the Albuquerque Journal one day, and I had this idea in my mind of wanting to do a piece on assimilation. So lo and behold, I'm reading through the paper, and here is a photo of these cubes. And I thought, oh, that's perfect, because I can have them all being assimilated by the large one, which in this piece represents the computer, by the way. And so as I'm reading along, I discovered that these are manufactured by a group called the Levitated Toy Factory in Albuquerque. And so I put the paper down, paid my bill, and drove over to the location of the factory and knocked on the door. And I said, would you sell me the mock-ups? These are actually, the real ones are made out of wood, and they're for playgrounds and children and so forth. These were just examples that they had made out of cardboard. And they said, well, we'll get back to you. And 2 days later, they called back and said, yeah, we'll sell them to you. So I was just delighted. So I brought them home, and they're covered with encaustic and symbols. And they're all in order of the languages that are spoken. So the red one, disregarding the computer, is Mandarin Chinese, Spanish, then English. And it's in descending order of how many living speakers there are of each language. Mm-hmm. The computer for me was both the hero and the villain of the piece, because on the one hand, it gave me such great tools to do the genetic work. I mean, when I first found my grandparents' diaries, I would drive to the state library in Santa Fe, and I would look up the New York Times on microfiche because they had lived in New York City when they married. My grandfather taught French there, and the diaries that my grandmother kept were very minimal. It was like, they were called line-a-day diaries. So each diary was 5 years, and you had maybe 3 or 4 lines for the year that you were recording. And they were very mundane. It was things like she would record the weight of everyone in the household or the temperature. Not very interesting, but they were very literary people, and they were both educated. And so they would go into the city and they would see plays and attend lectures. And I could cross-reference that on microfiche by reading the New York Times. Well, then when the computer became as omnipresent as it is, it was so readily available. So on the one hand, I love that. The downside was the computer was gradually homogenizing language. And so instead of cursive writing, which is almost like a thumbprint, you know, everyone's writing is very individual and very distinguishable from everybody else's. And now everything was focused on keyboard proficiency, which I found very boring. I mean, visually it's just not very interesting. If you compare that to some of the Mayan hieroglyphics, for example, there's just no contest. They're just much more interesting. So that's the story of assimilation and how it kind of all unfolded, and it has a lot of double entendre in the piece. And people really like the piece because the cubes are fun and they have all the piercings and everything. So this was one of the first examples of language as a subject of my identity work. And then we're going to move down to these 3 scrolls down here. Okay, this piece is called Erased, and I created it for a show in Santa Fe that was dealing with censorship, which seems to be rearing its ugly head again. A lot of people, when the call for art went out, the first book they thought of was The Scarlet Letter. But I went way far back in history instead, and this is about the burning of the Mayan codices by a bishop named Bishop de Landa. He was in the Yucatan Peninsula in 1562, and he gathered all the books that the Mayans had put together over time and basically made a big bonfire of them and burned them. So this is what he said about it, which I find amazing. These people, the Mayan, used certain letters with which they wrote in their books about ancient subjects. We found many of these books written with these letters, and since they held nothing that was not falsehood and the work of the evil one, we burned them all, which they regretted to an amazing degree and which caused them much affliction. Well, 3 of the codices survived, and they are now in museums that loan them their names. So there's one in Dresden, the Dresden Codex. There's one in Madrid, the Madrid Codex, and there's one in Paris. And interestingly, it took years to decipher the Mayan writing because the scholars first started trying to decipher it as if it were like our alphabet and our language, which is phonetic, which it's not, it's hieroglyphic. But they finally deciphered them, and they didn't find the work of the evil one. What they found was that the Mayans were amazing astronomers, and these are largely recordings of their astronomical observations. And they were particularly interested in the planet Venus. Of course, they couldn't see all the planets in our universe that we can see now with our telescopes, but they were very interested in Venus. And so this inverted figure represents Venus. And what I find so interesting about that is you can find an upside down figure like that in the petroglyphs in the Southwest. and it represents death. Well, to them, it was death, because Venus is both the morning star and the evening star. And so in a sense, metaphorically, Venus died during the time it disappeared from being visible to them until it reappeared as the morning star or the evening star. So the scrolls are essentially trying to show the burning of the codices as they get darker and darker and darker. And originally this piece had some burned pieces on the floor that were part of the piece, but I exhibited this in a gallery in Albuquerque, and another artist and I were showing there. Our work was called Cosmic. She did some planetary paintings too. And we gathered for the artist talk, the infamous artist obligatory talk for exhibitions, and we were going around the gallery and we came to this piece, and all the pieces that were supposed to be represent the burned parts of the codices were missing. The maintenance crew has swept them up the night before. They thought they were trash, and they looked like trash. And I couldn't really be mad because it was so funny, you know? It's like you could just imagine how this thing happened. Anyway, what happened to Diego de Landa was that he got called back to Spain after the burning, and he was put through, he was accused of executing an unauthorized auto de fe, which is an inquisitional ceremony to root out heretics. And he was jailed for a while, and while he was jailed, he wrote a book about the Maya, and that then, ironically, became main source material for future scholars who were trying to decipher the Mayan code. He eventually, here's more irony, he eventually was returned to Yucatan, and the Catholic Church made him a bishop. Oh boy. So that was the end of De Landa. The companion piece kind of to this is this little book over here. And in researching the Mayan hieroglyphs and so forth, I sent off to Mexico to get, they were written on bark paper. It was made from the inner bark of a fig tree. And I thought, well, that'd be kind of fun to write on that and see what it felt like. So that's what this little book is. It's on bark paper, and I just copied drawings of some of the hieroglyphs. This doesn't really mean anything. It's just, you know, referencing their work. Okay, so let's see, the next one are the cosmic scrolls right here. These are, we'll talk a little bit about maybe problem and solution when you're an artist, and so these were very problematical. I did these first on paper. I had two really long tables in my studio, and I actually stitched pieces of the paper together to make the length of the scroll. I just sewed them on my sewing machine. And I did the imagery with alcohol-based ink. Well, come to find out, alcohol-based ink fades over time. They call it fugitive. It's fugitive because it doesn't last. So there I was with these scrolls that I knew I could never sell, and that I knew were going to fade, and yet it was major work for me, and I didn't want to lose them. I had a friend in Albuquerque who had a company that did digital imaging, and he said, well, let's digitize them. And I also wanted to experiment with Tyvek, which is a construction material. And you've probably seen it when you drive around places. It'll say Tyvek, Tyvek, Tyvek on new construction. It's used as a vapor barrier and for construction purposes. I had played around with it with paint, and it repels liquid because that's what it's being used for, as a vapor barrier. But I found that if you printed with pigment ink, it was good. And I loved the material because it doesn't tear, it's lightweight, You can roll it up, it's very easy to ship. So these scrolls are kind of the tail end of exploring place as a part of identity. The first ones explored landscape, and that's very critical, especially to native tribes, the geographical place that they're from. And so now we're looking at, okay, what is your place in the universe? And my dad was an amateur astronomer, so I come by the interest naturally, but I don't come back anywhere close to his knowledge. He built his own telescopes. He built his own computer. He was just a real tech kind of a guy. So we got these printed, and I was just ecstatically happy with them because on the computer, he could take out, like, I would have a line here where I had stitched pieces together. He could erase it on the computer. He could just take out those little pixels of that, and so they ended up being much more perfect than anything I had put together by hand. And I can duplicate them. They're one of a kind now, but I can duplicate them. So this one is Pluto. This is Pluto's moons. Pluto has a jaded history in the cosmos. It's 1 year it's a planet, the next year, no, it's not a planet, it doesn't have any gravitational pull, it can't be a planet. Then they reinstate it. So I was fascinated by that. I thought that's really interesting. And when they started getting more advanced telescopes like the Webb and so forth, they discovered that Pluto had more moons than they thought, and they were very irregularly shaped. Like, this is actually a moon, this thing looks like a rock here. So that was interesting. This one is Jupiter. This is actually my favorite. And Jupiter has tons of moons. It's got like 60 moons, and they're still discovering moons. So on the bottom, these are all moons. And in Native American iconography, these are not crosses, these are stars. These represent stars. On the top, I was reading an incredible book by Dava Sobel. I don't know if any of you are familiar with her work, but she writes science books. And what I loved about her book, The Planets, was she didn't discount the early conceptions of the universe and the myths. She respected them, but she also talked about current science and what we believe now. And the most interesting thing she did was she did a horoscope for the launch of the Galileo mission. And it proved to be like true. She printed the prediction for it when it was launched, and that's the top horoscope. And they're not exact. I'm not real exact in horoscopic imagery. And then the bottom one, the horoscope for it, was predicting the death of the Galileo probe. And indeed, it did die on that day, and it was because it had a radioactive payload. So they crashed it into Jupiter instead of trying to save it in any way, because it was radioactive by then. Sound, and how in space there isn't any sound because there's no matter for the sound waves to travel through. But what NASA did was they recorded the radiation being emitted from the various planets, and they converted that to sound that we could hear. So then we made these QR codes, which Diane posted up by the different scrolls, and if you scan those with your smartphone, it'll play you the sound of Jupiter, it'll play you the sound of Pluto, and then this one is a supernova. And so it doesn't have a sound per se. What it does is when you scan the QR code, it does a simulation of a supernova. So this was SN 1054, the supernova. And what interested me about this is it was observed and recorded by the Native American people as a petroglyph in the Arizona, New Mexico area. And it was simultaneously recorded by the Chinese, who had a written language in China. And I thought that is just so amazing and mind-boggling that they were thousands of miles apart, and yet they're both seeing the supernova. So the Crab Nebula is the remains of this supernova. And if you scan the code there, it'll play you a simulation of a nova that the NASA people put together. And I apologize for the scanning, because when I created the QR codes, there weren't any ads. And now when you scan them, you have these very annoying ads that you have to get rid of before you actually hear the sound and see the simulation. So that's kind of everything I wanted to share with you. And if you have any questions, I'd be glad to try to answer them, as long as they're not science questions.
I'm interested in how familiar you are with the various languages that you portray.
Not very familiar. My background was 2 years of Latin in high school and a year of Spanish, 2 years of French in college, and a summer study in Normandy. And I don't speak any of the languages fluently like my grandfather spoke very fluent French. I do not speak that. And I think the one that's been the most helpful to me actually has been the Latin, because it's the base of all the Romantic languages. So when I studied the other languages, I'm really looking at them visually only. And I'm very drawn to the Asian languages and to the hieroglyphics and the things that look interesting and complicated visually. I'm not that interested in literal translation at all.
But that sounds very artistic to not be literal.
Yeah, right. Hope so.
I have a question. What are you working on now, or what's next?
Well,
Great question.
I'm not sure what's next, and I haven't really been doing work while we got ready for this exhibition. And I'm being very drawn, this is going to sound terrible, I'm being drawn by what's happening politically to being very concerned about the direction that we're heading in targeting other groups and minorities, and genocide, actually. And there's a whole website that talks about what the stages of genocide are, and we're in some of them. We're making symbols out of people, and we're targeting groups that don't have very much political power, and we're using language to demean them, and I find that very concerning. The problem with going that direction in work is then you're in a situation where you're putting your imagery in competition with your message. And if you let your political, particularly if it's a political message, if you let that take over the artwork, you're creating more propaganda than art. And so I'm just kind of reading about that now and toying with the idea of doing that. But it for sure will be something to do with language.
Yes, Harriette, what I always want to ask you, especially with this body of work, how much of an influence the Native American iconography has been in your work?
Immense.
Huh?
It's been immense.
Well,
And I credit my husband with that.
It's very powerful, very strong, and as an artist, I'm always very, very concerned with copying. When I first moved here, the pencil clips and the Native American, which really I fell in love with, not reproducing anything like that. So conscious of that, because it's not me, and I cannot take advantage of that. So I was wondering, if you were coming from Florida, or your background, to come here, move here, and married to Kat, and then how do you produce your work and keep, this is amazing, really, by the way. That's why I want to ask you your interest. I guess the question is, what kind of influence has had in your life and your body?
Oh boy.
You say that, our life, impacts our artwork. And
Yeah,
artwork is our life.
absolutely.
So, it's both two-way street, but for you, this amazing body of work, can you talk a little bit about that?
I can. I might cry, but profound. For me, the Native American culture, everything has meaning. whether it's the fringe on a shawl, or it's the ribbon on a shirt, or the rattle, they're not casual. They have meaning, and the meaning always goes back to their spiritual base. I love that. I relate to that, much more so than Dinlanda and organized religion, which I think they've grown. There, of course, is always good, but they've grown into, they're too organized, and the hierarchy of values is wrong, in my opinion. For example, the whole idea of land ownership, not in the Native American thinking. You don't own land, you respect nature and you share. The whole emphasis on the tribe instead of the individual. You don't, I mean, you can read about things like the relay races and how, yes, everybody runs the race, and then the leaders slow down so they can all cross the finish line together. So there's been a real loss of community in our culture. And I've been very influenced and impressed by that, just moving here. I moved here in 1995. And I bought a small place off the Los Alamos highway in this little community of El Rancho. And I could hear the drums from San Ildefonso. And I was very curious about that. I really wanted to attend the ceremonies, but I didn't know how and whether or not I'd be welcome. And eventually I learned about that. And just the more and more I studied and read, the more impressed I was with how these people have it right. They have the right values and the right order. And then when I met my husband, and I learned even more, even their governmental structure is so different from ours. Their leaders, at least in the Pueblo, are called caciques, and they're the spiritual leaders. And then there's a government, we would call it a lay government. And if there's a conflict, it's the spiritual leaders who have the final say, not the political leaders. So all of that impressed me, and when I see what's happening now, I feel like it's even more important to embrace those kind of values instead of guns and restricting voting and banning books and a lot of the scary things that are happening. So,
Thank you.
thank you. Thank you very much.